Good morning. Good morning. I love to stand here and watch everybody talking and expressing, and it's just so nice. But thank you so much. We're about to begin. Our computer is back together again. My name is Lorraine. I'm co-chair of the forum group with Mark, who's working on the computer. And there's about 10 or 12 other people in our group that help invite and get presenters here and host them. So I had a whole bunch of things to tell you. I just wanted to say there's a basket over there. We have a sign-up sheet if you want to be on the forum fan email list, and wanted to bring your attention to the article in Sunday's paper on ThriveOn King Drive. That was our speaker last Sunday. So this is another aspect of it, a little deeper into the founding, but the heart of it is what we heard last Sunday when they talked about the community and how they got that involved. So just wanted to tell you all of that. And
I'm going to be passing this clipboard around. If you're interested in being on the First Unitarian Society listserv, and please print very, very legibly, okay, so that we can read it and get you signed up.
Right, he'll pass that
and
around.
We'll send out messages, about the forum on that listserv.
Like if you ever wanted to know how to reach the speaker or something, we'll be sure to send that to I call it the forum fan email list. So it's just for people who come to the forums. So just so you know. And today we're welcoming Michael Schuler. He's a humanist and former senior minister at First Unitarian Society in Madison. Michael will review a wide-ranging review of the question, humanism, in command or in crisis. So Michael is with us today.
Humanism in Command or in Crisis happens to also be the title of my new book, which came out in late September. And if you are intrigued by the little synopsis that I'm going to be offering this morning, then you have this golden opportunity to purchase your own copy of the book after the forum at the rock bottom price of $20. It is wonderful to be here. Some of you may recognize me because I have actually spoken many times here at First Unitarian, the other First Unitarian Society. Compliments of Drew, and we've exchanged pulpits over the years prior to our retirement, so it's good to be here. But I was just allowing to a couple of your members that in all the years that I've been here, I have never been in this room. I'd never walked up the stairs to the Max Otto room, was aware of its existence, but had never visited up here. It's a lovely room, and it was a mistake on my part because other than Frank Lloyd Wright, Max Otto was probably the best known member of the First Unitarian Society of Madison. He was a legend in his own time in Madison. So it's good to be here in a room that bears his name. So like many of you, during the COVID-19 pandemic, my wife Trina and I spent our evenings at home rather than out in the world enjoying restaurants and theater productions and sporting events. And so at one point in time, out of desperation, we fired up the old DVD player and we binge watched 12 seasons of Bones, TV series that began in 2005 and ended in 2017. How many people have seen Bones? It's actually being rerun on some stations right now. Well, those of you who've seen some of these episodes know that the main character in Bones is a forensic anthropologist by the name of Temperance Brennan, who is nicknamed Bones by her colleagues because she specializes in the human skeletal system. She is a quintessential humanist. Temperance is the embodiment of reason, who brings the same critical eye to both her professional pursuits and her personal affairs. Brennan would surely second Albert Schweitzer's comment that, quote, all progress in the world in the last analysis is produced by rationalism. But in her dismissal of emotionality, sentimentality, metaphysical faith, and even the maternal instinct, in the absence of all these different qualities, she leads an intellectually engaging, but otherwise a rather unfulfilled life. And as the series progresses over the years, Brennan's friends slowly help her to find herself as a feeling as well as a thinking being. The series Bones presents Temperance Brennan as a serious and very effective researcher. But at times in the episodes, her statements seem extreme enough that she seems almost a parody of a humanist scientist. Is she, though? Is she any less believable when we watch her than a real-life character like, say, Richard Dawkins? Folks like this believe that humanism has been a positive animating force in the rise of Western civilization. And they insist that if a more general application of humanist principles was made, we could all look forward to a brighter future. But there's a growing chorus of voices that disagrees with this premise. And they point to the sprawling problems that now threaten to consume our planet. And these naysayers, they maintain that without significant modification, humanism may make a dystopian, if not an apocalyptic future more likely. So which perspective is closer to the mark? That's the question for today. So let me continue this discussion with a contemporary academic who has touted humanism as an indispensable philosophy for the 21st century and beyond. In his best-selling 2018 book, Enlightenment Now: How Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress Succeed, in that book, the Harvard professor Steven Pinker presents what is undoubtedly the most comprehensive and affirming brief on behalf of humanism that I have read in the last 30 years. How many people have read Enlightenment Now? It's a big book, I will own that. Now, Pinker's definition of humanism is admirably succinct, if perhaps just a bit too broad. Humanism, he explains, may be defined as a package of values designed to maximize human flourishing. A package of ideas that are designed to maximize human flourishing. And to the question whether it has achieved that purpose, Pinker's answer is a resounding, unqualified, you bet, yes. And so he begins his encomium with the 18th century European Enlightenment, to which he assigns credit for advancing 4 ideas that have shaped the modern world. And these 4 ideas are reason, science, progress, and humanism. Now, Steven Pinker esteems the Enlightenment because, as he then proceeds to document at great length, it has undoubtedly worked. The Enlightenment has worked. Humankind has made progress on multiple fronts, despite protestations from the apostles of what he calls declinism. In a rare burst of mixed literary illusions, Pinker describes these declinists in our society as, quote, hollow men eating their naked lunches in the wasteland while waiting for Godot. Now, for his part, Pinker serves up reams of statistical evidence that show that the world has made spectacular progress in every single measure of human well-being. It is the greatest story seldom told. Pinker believes that too many of us have been negatively conditioned by news that over-reports the world's problems while failing to highlight the many ways in which our lives have demonstrably improved. None of us, he says, are as happy as we ought to be, given how amazing our world has become. And credit for all of this improvement belongs to our society's growing commitment to reason, science, humanism, and its confidence that further progress lies ahead. Now, Pinker will concede that human beings are not always rational. Sometimes we all we all succumb to cognitive and emotional biases that cloud our judgment. But that said, on the whole, in one realm after another, we are seeing the conquest of dogma and instinct by the armies of reason. Donald Trump aside. In discussing science, the fruits of which have been immeasurable, Steven Pinker laments that scientific inquiry has too often been hindered not only by stubborn religious superstitions, but by intellectuals in the humanistic disciplines who have yet to recover from the disaster of postmodernism. Nevertheless, when all is said and done, reason and science have fully demonstrated their efficacy. And if unexpected adverse developments occur, it is probably due to a variety of forces and factors that have simply managed somehow to elude science and reason's authority. That's where our problems lie, the absence of rationality and science. Now, his book is unapologetically anthropocentric because it focuses almost exclusively on human needs and human desires and human interests. Humanism does not exclude the flourishing of animals, he assures us, but our focus should always be on the welfare of humankind. Reason, science, an unshakable belief in progress, these are key elements of the humanistic credo. But Pinker also presents humanism as a much-needed moral alternative to theism, to the belief in God. And he describes the world's most religiously observant societies as hellholes. And he recommends as an antidote to this, a realistic outlook governed by rational thought and focused on human fulfillment. As countries get smarter, he says, they inevitably turn away from God. Now, this is a variety or a species of humanism that I call doctrinal humanism, because it seems to hold that its central claims are self-evident. Steven Pinker's arguments basically repeat, however, what humanists have been saying already for almost a century, although he marshals much more data to support his claims. So most notably, and I'm sure some of you are aware of this, way back in 1933, a group of sympathizers began working together to create the first Humanist Manifesto. And since then, there have been at least 3 more iterations of that original manifesto, the most recent one having been drafted and circulated in 2003. Now, although each one of these documents differs somewhat, they consistently emphasize some of the same points that Steven Pinker makes. These are 5. First, the evolutionary superiority of Homo sapiens and the centrality of human needs and interests, a position succinctly described as anthropocentrism. That's number 1. 2, a naturalistic outlook that finds no empirical basis for the existence of supernatural agents of any kind or for the revealed truths that they prefer. That's out of bounds. 3, the unique and unparalleled primacy of reason as a means for understanding the world and negotiating its terrain. 4, the unrivaled capacity of science and technology to create and to indefinitely maintain an advanced civilization. And 5, the promise of unlimited material and social progress under the suzerainty of reason, science, and technology. So these then are what I believe to be the central tenets of contemporary doctrinal humanism. So just how much influence has this school of thought had on our culture at large? It is indeed true that most people in the United States still profess a belief in God, in heaven and hell, the veracity of Scripture, the efficacy of prayer, and so forth and so on. And yet, despite these professions of belief, in the conduct of their daily lives, many of these same people have casually substituted reason for faith, material pursuits for piety and devotion, reliance on their own resourcefulness over the providential hand of God, and the prospect of material rewards here on earth in preference for pie in the sky by and by. So clearly there's kind of a difference here between people, what they say they believe, and how they actually act and think. We have clearly mastered the art of holding these two contrasting ideas in our head at the same time without being bothered too much about their inconsistency. It's what we call compartmentalized thinking. Now, admittedly, only a small minority of Americans would opt for this label humanist, calling themselves humanists, as opposed to that more nebulous term spiritual, as in I'm spiritual but not religious. Still, the philosopher John Gray maintains that in Immanuel Kant's time, the creed of most conventional people was Christian. Now he says it's humanist. And the best-selling historian Yuval Noah Harari agrees with that assessment. He says the typical American today is simultaneously a nationalist, a free market capitalist, and a liberal humanist. Now, humanism's critics have responded with a variety of objections. Those who still harbor a religious outlook are bothered by humanism's strictly secular orientation and its absolute repudiation of any kind of metaphysics. Others, however, take exception to what they feel is an overestimation of the powers of human reason, a cramped perspective on human progress, and an excessive confidence in science and technology, and finally, the anthropocentric orientation that prioritizes human needs and interests over those of other life forms. Those are the most salient objections that I have discovered to the humanist credo. Taken together, many of these skeptics agree that in its present form, humanism isn't up to the challenges that our species now faces. So let's look at some of these. I've already mentioned John Gray. He's a philosopher, cultural historian from the University of London. And after the publication of Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, Gray dismissed this work as, quote, comic book history, because of its failure to honestly address many of the Enlightenment's contradictions. And Gray also accuses Pinker of scientism, because he presents science as a methodology capable of untangling all confusion and solving all problems. If we would only accept science's epistemological supremacy, all of our ethical and political problems would simply fade away, according to Steven Pinker. But John Gray says there is simply no evidence whatsoever to support that claim. It is a strange fallacy, he writes, to suppose that science can bring reason to an irrational world when all it can ever do is give another twist to its madness. He rues the fact that Homo sapiens' moral and ethical development has lagged far behind its scientific and material gains. Ethics and morals have been largely sidelined in the ceaseless pursuit of wealth and power. Human knowledge increases, he writes, while human irrationality remains much the same. That's John Gray. Now, in recent times, environmentalists and life scientists have proven to be some of the fiercest critics of humanism's core beliefs. And for purposes of these remarks, and the book contains many examples, but for purposes of today, I'm going to focus on just one life scientist, a woman by the name of Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she wrote a very important book in 2013 called Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a biologist, a distinguished professor, an enrolled member of the Upper Midwestern Potawatomi tribe. She's a scientist, however, who recognizes the limitations of her own scientific training of her own discipline. Now, she is grateful, she writes. She's grateful that science has equipped her to see aspects of nature that remain largely hidden to the uninitiated, to the non-scientist. But at the same time, Kimmerer agrees with the native scholar Greg Kahete that of the four faculties by which we apprehend the world, mind, body, emotion, and spirit, of these four faculties by which we apprehend the world, science privileges only the first and possibly the second. And so Kimmerer shares a story that was related to her by another one of her native friends. It seems that a plant scientist had ventured into the South American rainforest hoping to discover new and possibly useful botanical resources. This scientist is accompanied by a young indigenous guide who eagerly points out certain plants that might arouse the botanist's interest. And the botanist is pleasantly surprised by this young man's familiarity with many of the forest species, and he even knows their scientific formal names. And so he compliments the young man on his knowledge, on his achievement. And the young man with downcast eyes replies to him and says, "Yes, I have learned the names of all the bushes, but I have yet to learn their songs." Robin Kimmerer remarks that while scientific language aims for precision, it captures only a thin slice of reality, and thereby it misses much of what indigenous cultures understand and cherish about this land that they inhabit. Native peoples, she writes, employ a language of their own, a language of animacy, which she says is also the language that toddlers of all races and all cultures use when they're trying to describe their encounters with nature, until, she says, we teach them not to do this. Small children naturally regard plants and animals as people, beings who possess qualities, features not unlike their own. But then trained over time to regard a tree as an it rather than a thou, then that tree becomes something that's much, much easier to just chop down, cut down with a chainsaw, reducing it to just one more exploitable resource. Animacy is a quality that aspiring scientists are trained to ignore, if not to laugh at. She says getting professionals to consider the validity of indigenous knowledge is like swimming upstream in very, very cold water. And here, Kimmerer could be speaking directly to the celebrated humanist scientist E.O. Wilson. Prior to the advent of modern science, is there any knowledge worth preserving? Wilson asks in one of his books. He answers his own question, saying that pre-scientific cultures are wrong. They are always, always wrong. Without exception, they demonstrate a talent only for inventing myths and speculations. Now, Robin Kimmerer, for her part, never seriously doubts the value of her scientific training, but she draws a crucial distinction between the practice of science and the scientific worldview, which modern scientists like E.O. Wilson subscribe to, the scientific worldview. Real science, Kimmerer insists, brings the questioner into an unparalleled intimacy with the natural world, a world that is fraught with wonder as we try to comprehend the mysteries of all of this that is non-human that surrounds us. That's what a real scientist ought to be doing, she says. But when science is commandeered and placed in the service of an all-knowing worldview, then it ends up being used to reinforce a reductionistic, materialistic, economic, and political agenda. Ultimately, she says, it separates responsibility from knowledge. And Kimmerer notes that in today's engineered industrial world held in thrall by the scientific worldview, nature has simply become a Cartesian machine with human beings in the driver's seat. And this, she says, strikes indigenous people as highly arrogant. Among my own people, she says, humans are seen as the younger brothers and sisters of creation, and we are obliged to learn from the elders in the greater community of sovereign beings. But it takes humility to surrender to the lessons that these other sentient beings have to offer us. And that is not humility. That is not a virtue that one often finds among those who have thrown their lot in with the scientific worldview, that all-encompassing worldview. So this survey would not be complete without a foray into the field of literature, novels, poetry, and particularly when we're talking about novels, that genre called dystopian literature. And in dystopian literature, anti-humanist sentiments can be found in abundance. And almost without exception, these narratives describe a future world devastated by the unforeseen consequences of our own advanced technology. Now, there are many candidates to choose from here: C.S. Lewis, Margaret Atwood, Ray Bradbury, Cormac McCarthy. But for today, I'm just going to highlight one, Ursula K. Le Guin. She wrote a novel that has not been widely read. I started reading Le Guin when I was in high school. But this novel is entitled Always Coming Home. And in it, she envisions a post-apocalyptic civilization much, much different from our own. And her story is set in her own native California, probably Napa Valley, Sonoma Valley. But it's set at a time so far in the future that people can't not even recall how the great transformation took place. Who was responsible for it? They don't remember any of it, so far in the future. And so we find ourselves in the valley of the Kesh, K-E-S-H. And here the inhabitants, the Kesh people, they speak about a scary people who long, long ago had their heads on backwards. And these dimly recalled, terrifying entities were in reality the Kesh's distant ancestors, the people who were responsible for causing the near destruction of the planet. According to Kesh mythology, those who had done wrong mindfully. They had their heads on backwards. Now, lengthy sections of this novel describe the rituals, the songs, the holidays, the myths, the social customs, the architectural and transportation structures of this Kesh culture. And taken together, all these ethnographic details add up to an intimate portrait of a society that has reinvented itself following a global cataclysm. And she tries to imagine how human beings might emerge from the ashes and create something much, much better. A comfortable, creative, spiritually nurturing, egalitarian culture in harmony with the natural environment. That's what the Kesh have. They are a people who have created a sustainable culture by going backward, opting for a society rich in traditional values, rich in low-tech solutions, rather than a culture that prizes novelty and unrestrained technological innovation. Ursula K. Le Guin has stated elsewhere in one of her essays that Western civilization places too much faith in reason, elevating reason to a godhead. And the utopias that are conjured up by this Euclidean reason have now acquired a self-destructive capacity that demands, she says, a subversive response, which is what Always Coming Home intends to do, to create a subversive response. Finally, in our catalog of anti-humanists, let's consider a poet, the poet Robinson Jeffers. A Californian, like Ursula K. Le Guin, Jeffers was once one of America's most popular and acclaimed poets back in the 1930s and the 1940s. But his popularity waned, and today few of his poems can be found in any of the major anthologies. One reason for this is that at a time when the humanistic themes of progress and technological prowess were gaining widespread acceptance post-World War II, Jeffers' poetry spoke to a very different reality. He had a very dim view of Western civilization's accomplishments. In one of his poems entitled The Purse Seine, he likens our urban scenes to a net in which millions of clueless human beings, like a school of mackerel, hardly feel the cords drawing around. Our life-giving connection to the strong earth is being severed, and the masses of men and women are becoming completely dependent on their technologies. And so he sees mass disasters in the offing, if not in his children's lifetime, then perhaps a generation or two later. These things are progress, he writes scornfully. But surely one knows that cultures decay and that life always ends in death. A little bleak. In another poem entitled The Contemplation of the Sword, he trains his sights on reason. Considering the future, he declares that reason will not decide at last. The sword will decide. Not the sword in a literal sense of that word, but that which the sword symbolizes, the insatiable human hunger for power and domination. That's what will decide our fate. The 20th century's technological accomplishments, they left Jeffers cold. The miracle of human flight, for instance. I have seen that invention, he says, a chief desire of man's dreaming heart for 10,000 years. Unfortunately, men have made it the chief means of massacre. But this too shall pass, he writes philosophically. What's happening around us today may feel like a desecration, but the only way that we can deal with that is to uncenter our minds from ourselves. Uncenter our minds from ourselves. And following that up, I want to basically just read this one poem, perhaps Robinson Jeffers' most famous poem, Carmel Point, that underscores his complaint. He says, the extraordinary patience of things. This beautiful place, Carmel Point, defaced by a crop of suburban houses. How beautiful it was when we first beheld it. Unbroken field of poppy and lupin walled with clean cliffs. No intrusion, but 2 or 3 horses pasturing, or a few milk cows rubbing their flanks on the outcrop rockheads. But now the spoiler has come. Does it care? Not faintly. It has all time. And it knows that people are a tide that swells and in time will ebb and all their works dissolve. Meanwhile, the image of pristine beauty lives on in every grain of granite, safe as the endless ocean that climb our cliffs. And as for us, we must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little, and we must become confident as the rock and the ocean that we were made from. Okay, so what's the bottom line? My own feeling is that there are aspects of humanism that we would do very well to retain. It's one thing to criticize this humanistic worldview. It's quite another to downplay science's indispensable role in healthcare and renewable energy and many, many other forces that impact on our lives. One lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that too many people in our society didn't take the science seriously enough. Or worse, they were encouraged to dismiss the warnings and the advice from medical experts and researchers as so much dicta from the deep state. Progress, on the other hand, progress has become a vexed term because of its singular focus on technological advance and a standard of living measured almost exclusively in material terms. That has not weathered very well. The internal combustion engine, a digitalized multiverse, toxic industrial agriculture, burgeoning arsenals of destructive weapons. All of these are wreaking havoc on both the environment and our well-being, both physical and mental. Unfortunately, at least a few self-identified humanists have, in recent years, begun raising some serious doubts about the positions that their doctrinal counterparts have staked out. And one of the most notable of these new humanists is a fellow by the name of Anthony Pinn, P-I-N-N. He's an African-American professor of humanities at Rice University, and he is also a Unitarian Universalist. Dr. Pinn's project has been to replace the humanism that was founded on Eurocentric Enlightenment values, Steven Pinker, replace it with a more universalistic philosophy that takes into consideration the experience and the needs of the world's marginalized peoples. And so, in fact, Pinn's brand of humanism can truthfully be said to represent a kind of an anti-humanism, in that it explicitly rejects much of the platform on which doctrinal humanism, as I've described it, rests. Now, what Anthony Pinn and Steven Pinker's humanisms do agree upon is the irrelevancy and even the unreality of any supernatural entity that meddles in human affairs. They both reject that out of hand. But Pinn, unlike Pinker, reserves a place for religion in his humanism. Religious language, religious celebration, religious speculation can and must play a role in human beings' lives. And we understand that as Unitarian Universalists, right? He says that whether one is a theist or a non-theist in their thinking and in their practices, there is a basic human need to render our lives meaningful. And theists do this by believing in a divine being that impinges upon the world and controls their destiny. We non-theists do it by relying strictly on the capabilities of the human species. Now, like its doctrinal counterpart, Pinn's humanism draws on the discoveries and the insights of science. And for him, the concept of symmetry occupies a central place. Symmetry, he says, is one idea by which man throughout the ages has tried to comprehend and to create order and beauty and perfection. But, and the qualification, Pinn warns against vesting science with more authority than is warranted. Science, he says, is never free from the taint of socioculture, commitments, and biases. Lacking an element of self-critical awareness, science can easily morph into scientism, a faith of its own. And then finally, his critique of the narrative of progress, so dear to many doctrinal humanists, is quite telling. He advocates instead what he calls a measured realism in place of that one-directional linear vision of history that emerged in the Enlightenment. Progress, he says, is by no means inevitable, and it is just as likely that societal transformations will produce misery rather than uplift. This is a different humanism, he says, one made more worldly, more world-worn, based on the ways in which advances in human knowledge and capacity have worked against the flourishing of life. And then finally, he also rejects the immoderate anthropocentrism that has long been a talking point for doctrinal humanists. While non-theistic humanism is grounded in the raw stuff of human struggle, its adherents need to recognize that ours is but one of a myriad of species that inhabit the planet. Accordingly, he says, in good Unitarian fashion, we must act in ways that recognize the web of existence as opposed to a simple assertion of humanity that ignores this interconnectedness. So at the end of the day, then, the question is not really, are you or are you not a humanist? Rather, the question is, which humanism is the best fit for you? So before I open the floor for the sale of books, questions and comments on the presentation? Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you try to
Summarize that? Well, we're basically saying that there are all kinds, there are all kinds of experiences that many of us have as human beings that don't fit into that rationalistic box. Near-death experiences is one that's alluded to. People are probably familiar with the author Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickeled and Dimed in America, Fear of Falling, all those kind of books. Well, she was trained as a scientist too, rock-ribbed humanist. She was Humanist of the Year in 1999. She wrote a book in about 2014 that describes having had an experience of an ineffable other. It came upon her just completely unbesought. She could not explain it at all, but she said it was real, it transformed my life, and on that basis, she had to revisit her whole humanistic philosophy, not necessarily subtracting a lot from it, but adding that imponderable element to it. Yeah. Right. Yep. In terms of the humanist perspective, well, first of all, I wrote my doctoral dissertation in 1982. On religious humanism in 20th century American thought. And I spent a lot more time than in this book dealing with the manifestos and the exposure of Unitarian Universalists to this philosophy. By the way, there was only one Universalist that signed that manifesto. There were 12 Unitarian clergymen that signed it. But anyway, at the time, clearly, Unitarianism, more than Universalism, was moving out of its theistic phase and into that humanistic camp, which continued on through the 70s. And I remember going to a regional meeting of Unitarian Universalists up in Minneapolis. And the speaker at that time said that Unitarian Universalism would be much more successful if it ended up kind of dropping this whole kind of eclectic, approach to spirituality and described itself as a humanistic movement. At which point in time, most people agreed. My own experience then, in 42 years in the parish minister, is that has shifted considerably. And I would say right now, well, I can't say right now because I'm 6 months into retirement, but by the time I retired in my congregation in Madison, I would say that maybe a plurality of the members would have described themselves as humanists, but not a majority by any means. And a lot of that had to do with our exposure to Eastern spiritualities, the beginnings of interest in feminist spirituality and pagan Wiccan spirituality, and that shifted a lot of people's perspectives because people were just finding that rationalism just a little too dry, not enough heart in it, and even me, and I'm a lukewarm humanist at best, was often described by my congregation as being all in the head and not in the heart, and that's the way that people were perceiving increasingly humanism, and they wanted to go in a somewhat different direction. Yes, sir.
Yeah. How did
You know, I'm actually going to refer you to an amazing article that appeared in the Atlantic magazine, I think maybe in September, October, by David Brooks, the conservative columnist, in which he talks to this, why have we become so mean, was what the title of the article was all about. And he describes at some length, you know, the forces in our society that have caused people to become more mean, more individualistic, less involved in other people's lives, more self-aggrandizing. And there are a lot of different factors in that, but he describes it better than I could in the short time I've got right here. Yeah. Yeah. Reductionist model? Yeah. Yeah. Whoops. Oh, Um, so I'm not sure I've got the gist of your question quite right. I mean, I think that an author like Anthony Pinn, um, Humanism, a set of essays, is one of his books, um, does basically try to draw the distinction between a more nuanced and maybe less quantitative version of science and something that explores more deeply some of the less, I don't know what we say, materialistic basis for science. Um, Penn does a better job of describing that than I do, and I didn't get into it in a lot, you know, in great detail in the book, but there is a whole chapter devoted to life scientists that do explore that issue, you know, a variety of different voices. Right, right. Mhm. Yeah, I think that, you know, probably the perspective that I find most valuable is one that's relatively old, goes back to the 1940s. It's Aldo Leopold's, and it has to do with the land ethic, and it has to do with his whole philosophy summarized in, you know, a couple of his short book, like the Sand County Almanac, you know, about how we readjust our relationship to the natural world in such a way that we are not necessarily cutting ourselves off from a life that is comfortable, but at the same time, you know, doing justice to and creating a sustainable, you know, kind of relationship with the natural world. So I would always go back to Aldo Leopold and Sand County Almanac for an answer to that. Yeah. Well, as I alluded, I'm 6 years into retirement, and all of this has come to the surface, since I left the parish ministry. And I haven't followed it all that closely, although, I don't do Facebook, I don't do a lot of social media. So, I'm aware of the controversy, but I don't really have strong opinions about it because I haven't, working 4.5 years on this book, haven't paid attention enough to really know. What I've read about the retirement of the purposes and principles and the substitution with another statement bothers me. But I really can't go any farther than that. I mean, but I grew up as a Unitarian Universalist. I mean, I grew up with the 7 principles and the 6 sources, and I think that they, work just fine. Right. Yeah. Amen. Anyway, well, time is growing short, and I know that there's another service, and so I appreciate your attention, and it's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.